As winter melts into spring, many people in Boston think more about gardening. It's also time for the annual Gardeners Gathering organized by the trustees. This year's free event takes place on Saturday, March 23rd at Northeastern University. To tell us what's planned is our guest from the trustees, the engagement manager, Michelle De Lima. Thank you very much for being with us again, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I know this could be an event for people with just a garden in the backyard or people at a community garden, but people who are watching the show tonight might be wondering, what does engagement have to do with gardens?
Well, it has a lot to do with it. So we define it pretty broadly. A lot of education. We do a lot of garden education. And then also a lot of community building around our gardens, around events like this, and also at events in programs throughout the summer.
Well, if you're talking about community gardens, we have to maybe get into a little bit of a tutorial here because they don't just come out of the ground and sit there. I mean, it takes a lot of human involvement to get this to happen, right?
Absolutely. The gardens are mostly about the people that are in them. You know, the land is important, the plants are important, but what makes community gardens so special and so different from farms or even urban farms and from a backyard garden is really that they're all about people coming together, different generations, different cultures coming together and sharing skills.
Well, one of the things that we've been hearing more about lately is how these gardens can close the food gap. How is that important in the neighborhoods?
It's really important because access to fresh food is not always easy, and it's certainly not always cheap in a lot of neighborhoods in Boston. And these gardens provide a place where people can grow their own, which is the best way to get the cleanest, healthiest food.
What about what goes on when you've got, let's say in a community garden, different kinds of people talking to each other, picking up information from each other? What's the benefit of that?
I think there's a ton of knowledge sharing. People end up growing things that they've never grown before. You know, they taste something and they like it, and they try a vegetable or green from a culture that, you know, isn't their own. And I think that's really good. It helps. Gardens are one of the few places left in the city, I think, where people can really interact with people that they wouldn't know otherwise.
Well, another kind of interaction is what's going to be going on at the Gardeners Gathering. Let's say for somebody who hasn't been doing it much lately or has never done it before, what can they expect?
Well, they can expect a lot. So we have almost 30 workshops, lots of different things, anything from skill building workshops like how to start seeds or how to build healthy soil, how to make your own sauerkraut, to bigger picture questions like how gardens can help with climate change and the public health impacts of community gardens. So lots of different workshops. And then we'll start with Mayor Walsh gives out community garden awards and gives a keynote presentation. And we have a special guest speaker. This year it's Aziz Dekan from the New York City Community Gardening Coalition. And he's going to come and talk about, you know, the history and current day of community gardens in New York. They've done a lot of work with gardens and climate change, so we'll focus on that.
Now this is another connection that a lot of people might be a little puzzled by. Gardens and climate change. What is the connection?
Well, open space has a big role to play in helping cities adapt to climate change. So it helps with managing stormwater. It helps with providing a source of local food that's very low fossil fuel emission. And then it can also help with using up organic wastes with composting and stuff like that.
Now, stormwater, a lot of it ends up in Boston Harbor. Well, why is it better to have some of it falling onto garden space?
Good question. So if rain falls onto pavement, it just runs off, often with road salt and other contaminants into the harbor. And if it falls on a garden, it gets filtered through the nice, healthy soil. It's clean by the time it reaches the groundwater, and it stays in groundwater where it's useful to us instead of getting washed off with contaminants into the bay.
Well, I know when people start gardening on their own, one of the first things they might be confronted with in Boston is soil quality. We have a lot of older buildings. Some of them don't exist anymore, but maybe some chips of lead paint still might be there. So how do people get over that hurdle? Can you help them with that?
Absolutely. So in community gardens, we test the soil, and I would recommend that anybody should do that at home too before they start a garden. It's really simple. You can send a test off to the University of Massachusetts. It only costs $15, and they have very good directions on how to do soil testing. So it's good to know what you're working with. But then if you find out that the soil isn't good, or if you don't want to go through the testing part and you think, I just don't want to deal with this soil, you can do container gardening or gardening in raised beds. And those are both things we're going to cover at the Gardeners Gathering.
I know a couple of your workshop topics here. I know one of them is going to be about urban homesteading. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's kind of a catch-all term, so a lot of the workshops would fall under it. It's not just about growing food, but also what you can do with it, and also about things that are a little different than just, growing vegetables. So we'll have somebody talking about how to keep not just chickens, but also quail, which are a really good small space bird to get eggs from. And we'll talk about urban beekeeping, which I would say is part of homesteading, preserving the harvest through fermentation, which is part of the urban homesteading idea. So those kinds of things.
I remember in the 1970s, homesteading was a way to rescue neighborhoods that were plagued by disinvestment. What about quality of life on the street? Because you might have a piece of land that had been neglected for many years, and all of a sudden you get people coming together to garden on it. I mean, what does that mean for the neighborhood?
I think it means a lot. There's all these really interesting studies that even just living near a garden, not even participating in it, has some tangible mental health benefits. There's a study that came out last year that talked about that, which is really cool. People are in better moods. And also, if you're in the garden, you get more exercise, you get more social interaction, which can be really important, especially for seniors.
I want to come back to the keynote speaker, Aziz Dekan. He's from New York, and I guess he's going to be talking a lot about, organizing, advocating. Why is that important for gardeners?
Well, New York has a really interesting history where the city hasn't always been as supportive as Boston has of community gardening, so they've had to fight really hard to preserve their gardens, and they have a lot of housing pressure. And I think that even though Boston, the city, has been very supportive, that tension between housing and open space is always going to be here. And so I think that's an interesting thing. There are lessons to learn about that from him.
Another thing that occurs to me is that gardening can be a conduit for composting. And we're trying to train everybody in the city to do that eventually, but is that being done a lot right now with community gardens in Boston, at least?
Yeah, it can be tricky to include food waste in a garden because there's worries about rodents, but it can be done if you do it well. And even if you're not getting food waste into there, just getting leaves and plant matter and reusing that, turning it into soil instead of hauling it off to be composted elsewhere is good, and uses fewer fossil fuels.
I imagine one other concern for people, whether they're doing it in their own backyard or in a plot down the street with the community, is the expense. I mean, do people worry about that? I mean, can they get some help with finding a better way to save some money in cost of gardening?
Well, gardening can actually be pretty affordable. So the city supports gardens with free compost, and we do a seed donation program. Most of the fees are under $50 a year for a garden plot, and a lot of gardens actually help each other out, if they have a sliding scale, or there's people who pay more to subsidize so other people don't have to pay at all. So it's actually pretty affordable, and if you consider how much food you can grow, it's actually a good way to save money.
What about the joys of gardening? And I've walked by some places, whether in the Fenway or in Dorchester, Roxbury, and when I look closely at something that's been growing there, I get hungry.
Well, that's certainly an important part of it, having good stuff to eat.
Right.
And people also grow flowers, which I think are really wonderful. A lot of these gardens are in places where there aren't any parks. They're just in residential neighborhoods, and they provide a source of beauty for anyone who walks by, even if they don't garden.
I remember all those sunflowers in Roxbury. Finally, we should get to details once again about the event, when and where, and how to get more details.
Absolutely. So it is coming up Saturday, March 23rd. It's at Northeastern University at Shillman Hall and the Egan Center. We go between the two buildings. And if people want to learn more about this, they can go to thetrustees.org/gathering. And if they want to learn about programs that we have all year long in the gardens, that's at thetrustees.org/seedsow.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Michelle de Lima from the Trustees. We'll have more news in just a moment.